I want to spend a few moments to talk about shooting time lapses with the Canon 70D. Now, a time lapse is simply where you instruct the camera to take a picture every X seconds, minutes, every so often, and then you bring those back, those series of images back onto the computer, and you turn them into a video that plays smoothly. Now, as I said, that can be any time from every few seconds to every few minutes to every few hours. We'll talk a little bit about how that math works out and how long you need to shoot to get a decent video in just a moment. But let's go over quickly the gear that you need. You need some type of device to trigger the camera every X seconds. You could technically set your watch to beep every 2 seconds, and when it beeps you press the shutter button. That's not very practical. You're probably going to get pretty tired of that very quickly. So you want to spend a few bucks, about 20 or so, for something like this. This is very simple, an intervalometer. There's no way built into the Canon 70D to instruct it to take a picture every X seconds. The Nikons do offer that with the D7100 and the D5200. It's simplistic, and I still oftentimes would recommend something like this, or, and this is simply a device that tells the camera to take a picture every X seconds. It also acts as a remote shutter. You can just press a button to take a picture. Great for family pictures as well. I've talked about that in other videos. Or better, if you have a smartphone or tablet, Android or iOS, you should pick up one of these little dongles from Trigger Trap. They make ones for a variety of different cameras. One end plugs into your smartphone, running their app, and the other end plugs into your camera, the same as the intervalometer. And that gives you the ability, same as the intervalometer, to tell it to take a picture every X number of seconds. It's about the same price as well, but it does a whole lot more than that. You can have it trigger for over distance. So instead of time, every mile. Those are great for drive lapses, half-mile meters, walking, hiking, whatever, bike riding. You can tell it to take a picture when it hears a loud noise or when it detects motion using the device's camera. Not the camera you have it plugged into, but the device you're using to trigger it. So there's a ton more options in there, including the ability over time to adjust the time between number of pictures. When you set up with this thing, you start it at every 1 second. It's going to be every 1 second until you stop it and change it otherwise. With the Trigger Trap app, you have the ability to do some bramping, which means that you can change the amount of time, or the amount of time between exposures very easily. So very slick. I'm going to keep it really simple today. It's not really important how we're triggering the camera. Just going to go through the steps of what you're going to do. So I'm going to plug this in. I've already set it up to take a picture every 1 second. It's a very simplistic menu up here. You say how long before the first picture, the length of time, so if you wanted to shoot long exposures, that's something else Trigger Trap does very nicely, and your interval, how long between pictures, and then the number, and I've just got it set to infinity, so it'll just keep taking pictures until I run out of card space, or I tell it to stop. Now when I first got up here, there were some nice clouds in the sky, and that's really often what you want in a scenic time lapse. If you're taking pictures of seedlings coming up out of the earth, you don't really care about the clouds in the sky. But in this case, I do, and a lot of those have kind of burned off or melted away now, so it's not quite as exciting. Stay tuned to the end of this. I'll run whatever footage I get here. It's not going to be a lot, though, and I'll tell you why. If you tell the camera to shoot every 1 second, and then you bring that into your software, and oftentimes your video that looks smoothest and best is running at about 24 frames per second. So if I sat here for a minute, I would get 60 frames. If I ran those back at 24 frames a second, you can see that I get rounding, about 3 seconds of video from 1 minute of sitting here. So 10 minutes of sitting here, 30 seconds of video. Pretty short. So just keep that in mind as you're running your time lapses, and if you want really long ones, really beautiful scenery, you're going to have to be prepared to sit around for quite a while. Now, as I said, you need an intervalometer. There's a little remote port on the side of the camera. The camera doesn't need to be any special mode for this to be on. I just test it by pressing start button, and it takes a picture. Very nice. Now, this is sitting on a tripod. You're going to need some way to stabilize it. You're not going to be able to hold it still for all of this stuff. I have seen some fun time lapses where there are people holding the cameras and actually moving slowly. So there's certainly some fun and creative things to do there, but for most purposes, you're going to need a nice sturdy tripod or some way to stabilize your camera. Don't forget your rules of composition too, your rule of thirds. Right now I have the sky in the top third and the scenery down below. Again, this isn't going to be the most amazing time-lapse by far, but it gives you an idea. So, and also remember with the 70D, if you press the info button a couple times, you can get this nice electronic level that will let you know whether or not your horizon is leveled. Remember, you're going to be working with a lot of files when you bring these back, so you want to avoid having to make many adjustments, and you want to get this as right in the camera as possible. As I said, it doesn't really matter what mode you're on as far as, number of drive mode or remote or anything like that. It all works. But how about setting up your exposure? Well, most of the time, you could certainly put this in P mode. The camera would then decide, of course, its aperture and its aperture and its shutter speed, and that would be okay, but it wouldn't be good. Because you're going to have variations in both shutter speed and aperture primarily, you're going to have variations in your depth of field during your video, and that's not a good thing. So as the light levels change, the camera might suddenly decide that it needs to shoot one picture at f5.6 and the next one at f11. It's a pretty extreme change, but maybe it would happen. And your depth of field is going to change, and suddenly things that were in focus in one frame are going to be out of focus in the next frame, and that's going to be jarring and not what you want. So if you're following along and you're thinking, you say, well, how about AV mode, where you control the aperture and you say, stay at 5.6, shutter speed, move around as much as you need to get the shot. Well, that is better because it's less likely that in the type of time-lapse you're doing, slow shutter speeds are really going to matter a whole lot. But there's something you might not know about the camera every time it takes a picture. When you take a picture, the aperture, or when you're focusing, the aperture is wide open. Even if you've got it set at f11, which is very small, it's wide open. When you take the picture, the aperture closes down to the right size, the shutter opens and closes, and then the aperture opens back up. It happens very, very quickly, and it does a very good job. In a time lapse, as it closes to f11, opens back up for each picture, you can end up with these very small variations in the amount, or I should say in f11. There are tiny fractions of a difference from shot to shot, and that will introduce this type of flicker, a brightening and darkening of frames over the course of the exposure. So you want to, if you're really trying to nail a good time lapse, just AV mode alone isn't enough. In fact, you should go to manual mode, and you should disconnect your lens just slightly to lock your aperture in place. Let me explain that in a little bit more detail. So up on the front of the camera, you have your depth of field preview button, and when you press that, you should hear the camera move to that depth of field, to that aperture. What you need to do to lock your aperture in place is to press that button, and while it's pressed, disconnect the lens enough that you don't get a lens error when you're trying to take a picture. The 70D is very picky about that. And not too much that the lens is ready to fall off. There's a pretty good sweet spot there. It's large enough where the lens is still firmly connected. I wouldn't go carrying it around like that, but it's for sitting here, it's totally fine. And the pins aren't talking to each other anymore, which means that you now have that aperture locked into place because the camera's not communicating with it, and last it knew, it was told to be at f11, and it's not going to move from that until it gets power again. So that's what you can do to lock it down and avoid that flicker. So let's run through these settings again really quickly. So I've got the intervalometer plugged in. It's going to tell the camera to take a picture every 1 second. I've set up my composition. I've set up my exposure. I have done the slight disconnect so that aperture is firmly locked in place. And I didn't talk about this yet, but I'll throw this in now. I've chosen small JPEGs for this image. Now, most of the time when you sandwich these together and play them back, the highest quality you're going to be watching this at is HD. It's 1920 by 1080. Small JPEGs are slightly larger than that and give you a little bit of room to play with. It also gives you plenty of room on the card to shoot. You could shoot full JPEGs, and that will give you a lot of ability to manipulate the look of these images later, but those are very large file sizes, and you're not going to be able to fit a lot of those onto your card for longer time lapses. Short time lapse that you want a lot of control over, have fun, shoot those RAWs. You can shoot the smaller RAWs with a 70D, which is a nice feature, but for my purposes right now, I'm just going to be shooting the small JPEGs. They're going to work well for me and very smoothly, and being able to shoot every second without worrying about the buffer filling up and having some pauses there is nice as well. So it's all set. I'm just going to bring this button up and press start. And now it's going to take a picture every 1 second, and then I can just kind of go and relax and see what it gets. So I'm just going to let this run now for a while, and I'll throw up the footage it gets at the end of this video, maybe right now while I'm talking even. And if you have any questions about shooting time lapses with the Canon 70D, take a moment and come on over to my Facebook page, give it a like, and then post your message there. I'd appreciate that effort from you all if you want help from me. I'm building up a beautiful community of folks there, and loving the interactions that are happening. So take a few moments and do that, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thanks so much for watching, and if you haven't already, please subscribe.